Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm happy you're here with me today. I'm starting this video on a bit of an emotional high because I received the most wonderful comment on my last video from somebody who goes by the username IdiotUserQ2Z. So it was wonderful to receive that comment, and I'm glad I'm starting on a high note because this is going to be a bit of a rough video. So I'm going to be talking about the first book in a series called The Belgariad by David Eddings. This is a 5-book series. The first book being Pawn of Prophecy. This particular volume also contains the next 2 books after that, Queen of Sorcery and Magician's Gambit. And then there are a further 2 books in the Belgariad fantasy series. Now, this book was purchased and sent to me by one of my Patreon supporters. So this very generous person bought the book for me, paid to have it shipped to my address, and not only that, but he said if I enjoyed the first 3 books of the series, he would track down the remaining 2 and send those to me as well. So it was a very generous gift from one of my Patreon supporters. Along with the book, he sent me a little note that said, this was one of the first fantasy series I read, and although it's on the simple side when it comes to a lot of ideas and is a bit tropey in that it borrows a lot from Lord of the Rings, it has always had a place in my heart. So this is obviously a special book to the person who sent it to me, and the struggle I now have is that I didn't enjoy the first book, Pawn of Prophecy. Of course, I really want to say very nice things about it because the person who sent it to me is an important person in my life. My Patreon supporters are extremely important in that in this really difficult time of rising costs of everything with inflation and tariffs and all that nonsense, being somebody who is trying to get by on a disability income and who has a couple of kids that are growing and getting older, I am just struggling to make ends meet just to pay the bills each month. And so having Patreon supporters means that I can have a small entertainment budget every month, and that fact is what really helps to keep my sanity in the midst of everything else that's going on. So my Patreon supporters are hugely important to me, and as a result, I don't want to do anything that makes any of them unhappy. My problem is, and truthfully, one of my faults is the fact that I place such a high degree of importance to the trait of honesty. I've always been somebody who has prided myself in being an honest person. Now, saying that's a problem is almost like when you go to a job interview and they say, well, what would you say your biggest fault is? And the interviewee says, well, I'm just too much of a perfectionist. I do everything too perfectly. And so I feel like saying that I'm too honest it feels a bit like that. But truthfully, is there anything more important in the entire world than kindness? Even more important than honesty? And there are times when being slightly dishonest might be the most kind approach to take, and therefore is probably the better approach to take. But me being stubborn in my honesty tends to hurt people's feelings, perhaps, before stepping off my pedestal and taking away that pillar of my own personality. This is one of several reasons why I tend not to fit in various social circles. Other people know how to play this game. For example, when you go to GoodReads and you look at reviews of books that have been written by popular YouTubers, when you look in the 4 or 5 star ratings and read those reviews, you'll see a lot of other YouTubers, booktubers, rating their fellow booktubers' books very high and giving them these glowing reviews. And you really have to get into the 3-star and 2-star ratings to get perhaps a more honest opinion on what the average person thinks about the book. Now, the person who sent me the book did add this note when the book was sent that said, oh, and by the way, if you read it and absolutely hate it, I won't take offense with a bad review. I'd rather an honest review than one that panders. So that made me feel better. It didn't influence what I have to say about the book in terms of the review that's coming up, because I was going to say my honest opinions whether or not that note was sent. But what that note did do is make me feel less bad about saying the negative things I am going to say about Pawn of Prophecy here. Before I do so, though, I will say that I can absolutely see that this would be a very appealing book to a young, youthful boy. The person who sent it to me did say that it was one of the first fantasy series they read, and I can absolutely see how this would be a very appealing book for a younger person, and that obviously once you have that formative enjoyment of a fantasy series, that kind of nostalgia is going to carry forward into later life, into adulthood and whatnot, and the good feelings associated with the book are going to stick with the person when they are introduced to it at a young age. So I can absolutely see why this particular person would have read this book and enjoyed it. But having said that, let's get into why I didn't. In this video, I am going to be starting off by giving a couple of first impressions. I'm going to give a very brief, spoiler-free plot summary. Then, if I can turn my notes here, I'm going to talk about the technical aspects of the writing, as I typically do. I'm going to talk about some of the things about the story and the way it was written that didn't really work for me. I'm going to talk about a quite problematic aspect of the book. I'm going to get into a bit of the medieval arms and armor stuff that always interests me. I'm going to then get into a few good points that I pulled out of the book and then conclude with my rating on it. So that's what lies ahead here over the next too long a video, I'm sure. I'm really trying to make my book reviews shorter just for my own sanity and the amount of hours I spend editing and stuff, but I like to talk about these things, so here I am. I do divide my video into chapters so that you can skip all the parts that you would find boring and hopefully at least find one or two things that are interesting in this review. Starting off then with the first impressions, in looking at the book cover, at first glance I'm like, why is that boy holding his what? Oh, and then as you read, you realize that's his dagger that he is holding onto, but it is one of those kind of double take type images. And then as I start reading, I start with the preface where the author has come back years later to talk about this first work of his. And reading the preface almost sounds like the author has this almost apologetic tone for kind of how bland his story ended up being, because he says this in the preface: the story itself is fairly elemental. Good versus evil, nice guys versus nasty guys, or them versus us. It has the usual quest, the magic or holy thingamajig, the mighty sorcerer, the innocent hero, and the not quite so innocent heroine, along with a widely varied group of mighty warriors with assorted character faults. It wanders around for 5 books until it finally climaxes with the traditional duel between our hero and the bad guy. Would it spoil anything for you if I tell you that our side wins? Looking back at the story, I should confess that many of the crucial incidents seem to have popped out of nowhere during the writing. I hardly think that divine inspiration played any part in that. Wifely inspiration was significant, and so was editorial inspiration. That's an interesting point, because what I learned after the fact, when I was reading up a little bit more about the book after completing the first book, Pawn of Prophecy, was that his wife was actually a co-author for this whole series, and yet she's not credited as an author. It just credits David Eddings himself, even though his wife co-authored the book with him. One of the reasons that I was doing a bit of research on the book after the fact was I was really interested to hear what people enjoyed about it, because with my experience being highly negative, I did want to get other opinions. And obviously on GoodReads, the book has quite a high rating. And so I did want to check out some of the reviews that were there to see what people had to say about it. One of the GoodReads commenters had this to say: by his own admission, Eddings, much like Terry Brooks, was a struggling writer until he saw how Tolkien was selling like hotcakes and decided to churn out simple, easily digestible, highly formulaic fantasy novels. I should add that this first book was published in 1982, so this is kind of almost in that in-between period between classic fantasy and modern fantasy, and it's definitely riding on the shoulders of Tolkien and those early classic fantasy writers. But after the author's notes in the preface, then we jump into the prologue, and here we get just a huge info lore dump about the gods, the races, the world. We get introduced to the 7 gods in this universe, each of whom have their own race of peoples with their own unique names and cultures that follow the gods. And there's so many names and so much information just thrown at you right from the outset that it's a little overwhelming. And As an example, I'm going to quote this paragraph that is not from the prologue. This was from page 169 of the book itself, so we're already into the story when this stuff is stated, but here's what I mean by a lot of confusing names and stuff going on, as you often will see in fantasy. The Earl of Yarvik drew in a deep breath, glanced once at Aunt Pole, and shuddered again. Then he straightened. It started about 2 years ago, he said. I'd sailed to Kotu in Drasnia, and I met a Nadrak merchant named Grashor there. He seemed to be a good enough fellow, and after we'd gotten to know each other, he asked me if I'd be interested in a profitable venture. I told him that I was an earl and not a common tradesman, but he persisted. He said he was nervous about the pirates who live on the islands in the Gulf of Cherek, and an earl's ship manned by armed warriors was not likely to be attacked. His cargo was a simple chest, not very large. I think it was some jewels he'd managed to smuggle past the customs houses in Boktor, and he wanted them delivered to Dareen in Sendaria. I said that I wasn't really interested, but then he opened his purse and poured out gold. Thankfully, the book did come with a couple of maps that were placed at the beginning of the book so that as the story progressed and various places and peoples were mentioned, I could kind of follow along as to where we were in the world. So that was kind of helpful in the midst of all that information. Now for a very brief plot summary. As always, I'm not going to spoil anything in case you want to read the book yourself. But tell me if this sounds familiar. We have an orphan boy who grows up on a farm, and he doesn't realize he's the chosen one who must one day defeat the ultimate evil. Now, in Book 1, Pawn of Prophecy, we get a little glimpse at his early childhood so that we have the kind of foundation of where our main character Garion came from and the type of life he was living. And then at one point, he needs to suddenly leave the farm he grew up on with a couple of the adults because apparently something very important has been taken and needs to be tracked down. From there, our group of characters travels and goes in circles and travels some more and then goes to other places. And going back to the GoodReads ratings or reviews, we have this quote from another GoodReads reviewer who said, throughout the book, we were always traveling. We're here and we need to go there. We get there and we find we need to go somewhere else. Once there, another trip became necessary. I joked that I probably wore out shoes reading the book. And one of the funny things is that each time they're traveling, they are attempting to take on a new disguise in order to not reveal themselves to the evil people who are around and trying to keep tabs on them. So the same reviewer continues later in the review by saying, about our traveling group and the disguises they chose, we are freighters. Now we're selling turnips. Now we're arranging another cargo so we look like real freighters this time. Okay, it's become obvious we're not freighters. Now we'll travel as fake royalty. Polgara likes that better anyways. Oops, we've been recognized. Now we'll travel as us. And the funny thing is, no matter what disguise they took on, whether it be freighters or cargo carriers or royalty, they never worked. All the bad people always knew where they were and where they were going, and so it was really all kind of a waste of time with them taking on these various guises that they attempted to travel at. And when I look at the map to see where they had gone throughout the course of Book 1, I'm pretty sure they literally went in a huge circle. Starting at the farm, they kind of went southeast and southwest, and they took a ship up north. And then at the end of the book, they started sailing back south to one of the cities they launched from on the original ship voyage. So despite all the traveling, they really didn't get anywhere. But they did meet several kings of the various kingdoms that are around and tried to come to a bit of a consensus on what they should do about this mysterious evil object that has disappeared. And that's kind of where we are left at the end of the first book. Next, I'm going to get into the technical aspects of the writing, and I would advise you to skip this if you yourself are not an aspiring writer, because, like I always say, this is the sort of knowledge that will ruin your reading experiences, reading future books, and finding all the flaws that are in various books that aren't necessarily edited well enough. In this case, I was really hoping that its status as kind of a classic fantasy novel from the 80s would mean that the writing would be on a higher level than I've seen in a lot of more modern fantasy, where I've often been disappointed by the poor quality of the writing. But sadly, I have to say that the writing was not particularly good in this book. First of all, we have the problem of endless adverbs, which often coincide with dialogue tags that are not just your standard basic he said, she said. Now, adverbs do have their place, but they should be used really quite sparingly. And the reason is that by using a lot of adverbs, you are assuming that your audience is not very smart. An author who writes well should be able to, through the context of what is happening and through how characters are saying things, it should be clear to the reader how things are being said and done. It should not have to be explained. It kind of falls into the category of over-explanation, which is a trap that authors fall into who don't assume that their readers are smart, which is a mistake because most readers are very smart and quite capable of pulling this context out of your story. So here's a couple of examples of these adverbs that really kind of detract from the writing quality. A couple of characters are having a bit of banter back and forth here. "It's just as cold in Drasnia," Silk said. "Are you absolutely sure your grandmother didn't dally with a bear during one of those long winters?" "Someday your mouth is going to get you into a great deal of trouble, friend Silk," Barak said ominously. Silk laughed again. "I've been in trouble most of my life, friend Barak." "I wonder why," Barak said ironically. "I think all this could be discussed later," Wolf said pointedly. "I'd rather like to be away from here before the week's out if I can." So these are just coming back to back, and you can see that when Barak says, "I wonder why," we know that he's saying that ironically. The author doesn't need to explain that to us. Another example here. On the very next page, where two characters are speaking again. "This is idiocy," she said to Mr. Wolf about noon on the third day. "Everything is idiocy if you choose to look at it in the proper light," he replied philosophically. Again, it's so obvious that that's a philosophical statement. It doesn't need to be said. Not only that, but some of the adverbs chosen are just terrible. Like, here's a couple more examples. "The next morning they all mounted the wagons again and delivered their turnips to the warehouse of the Drasdian merchant. Then, their wagons rumbling emptily, they rode out of Doreen, bound toward the south." Rumbling emptily? I don't even know what to say about that. Here's another terrible one. Our main character, the boy Garion, is about to get into a fight. "His blood surged boilingly in his veins as he leapt into the fight, ignoring the single cry from Aunt Pole." His blood surged boilingly. That's not good writing. And here are a couple of other examples of poor writing that are not adverb related. "Wolf's expression became more serious as he rose from the chair in which he had been sitting." That is way overwritten. As he rose from his chair would have been fine. You don't need to say he rose from the chair in which he had been sitting. Obviously, he'd been sitting in the chair if he's rising from it. Here are a few quick examples that follow in fairly rapid succession to each other. Chapter 4 starts out with this sentence. "The seasons turned as seasons will." No kidding. Just a few pages later, "The winter plodded on, the snows came and went, and spring returned, as it always does." And related to time passing, "With the turning of the seasons, the years turned, and Garion imperceptibly grew older." What I would like to know about that is, how does a youthful boy who is going through puberty from early childhood into adolescence age imperceptibly? There's nothing more perceptible than a boy who's going through puberty and going through so many changes. Even the dialogue in so many cases was just so painful to read. Here we have a meeting of kings, and we have an ancient sorcerer here who's thousands of years old, and we have nobles, and so we have all of these very kind of high up important people, and this is how they talk to each other. And in this case, they're talking about a really weird situation where our boy Garion has got himself stuck in a room of the palace above where their meeting was taking place. And so they're talking to each other about what to do about this. And we start off with our ancient sorcerer, a fellow named Wolf. "We'll pass you up a couple torches," Wolf said. "Set one at the spot where you are now, and then go on down the passage with the other. As long as you can see the first one, you'll be going in a straight line." Very clever, Silk said. I wish I were 7,000 years old so I could solve problems so easily. Wolf let that pass. I still think the safest way would be to get some ladders and break a hole in the wall, Barak said. King Anhag looked pained. Couldn't we try Belgarad's suggestion first, he asked. Barak shrugged. You're the king. Thanks, Anhag said dryly. A warrior fetched a long pole and 2 torches were passed up to Geryon. If the line of the passageway holds straight, Anhag said, he should come out somewhere in the royal apartments. Interesting, King Rodar said with one raised eyebrow. It would be most enlightening to know if the passage led to the royal chambers or from them. It's entirely possible that the passageway is just some long-forgotten escape route, Anhag said in an injured tone. Our history, after all, hasn't been all that peaceful. There's no need to suspect the worst, is there? Of course not, King Rodar said blandly. No need at all. It's such a childish exchange to be taking place between these ancient and important people. And final example here is when Geryon, again as a young teen, maybe 13, 14 years old, is standing before a king relaying some information that he had previously withheld but now is relating to the king. The king obviously has mixed feelings about this. He starts by admonishing him, saying, You should have come to me immediately, King Anhag said. Anyway, Geryon went on, I had that fight with the wild boar. And then he goes on with his story. And I'm like, a 14-year-old has just been admonished by the king. And he's like, yeah, anyways, here's what actually happened. Here's an example of when our protagonist Geryon gets in a bit of a confrontation with another boy. The red-haired boy swaggered towards Geryon. What are you doing here? He demanded. I was talking with Mady, Geryon said. Who gave you permission? The red-haired boy asked. He was a bit taller than Geryon and somewhat heavier. I didn't bother to ask permission, Geryon said. The red-haired boy glowered, flexing his muscles threateningly. I can thrash you if I like, he announced. And Geryon realized that the redhead was feeling belligerent. Yeah, no kidding. He realized that the redhead was feeling belligerent. Way to go, Geryon, for figuring that one out. So, unfortunately, overall, it's kind of a thumbs down to the quality of writing. As for the events of the story, there is just so many times in the story where I was just going, wow, isn't that so convenient? And one thing that happened over and over again is the boy Geryon would just find himself kind of wandering off all on his own and suddenly find himself in a place where he was overhearing people talking about extremely important things. So I mentioned that time he was in the castle and got stuck in the upper room. He was just wandering through the castle, and wouldn't you know it, he ends up above the meeting chamber where all the kings were having this important conference. Or he'd be off in the woods. He'd just kind of go away from his group and, he'd overhear the bad people talking about their plots to overthrow certain other kingdoms and whatnot. Or, look, he's with this other group, but then he wanders off by himself and ends up in front of this door. And wouldn't you know it, on the other side of the door, there's these people talking about him and relaying information he had no idea about himself. And so he just kept finding himself in these positions to gather all this important information. One of the most egregious examples of him being left to his own devices in order to have events occur was Geryon is with these, again, kings and important people, and they decide to go out on a boar hunt. And Geryon is excited to be invited along because he's a young kid. He's never been boar hunting before. So they hand him a boar spear, and they're like, there you go, here's for your boar hunt. And he's like, I've never used one of these before. And essentially they're like, no, just point the pointy end at a boar if it comes running towards you. And the plan is that they're going to have these beaters who are off in the bush, beating the bushes to get the boar to come running towards the hunting party, who will then be ready with their spears to spear the boar and have a successful hunt. And so they're getting all this set up in the forest, and for no explicable reason, they just plunk Geryon down by himself on the animal pathway and say, all right, you just wait here with your spear. We're just going to be over there. good luck, and they all disappear into the woods. And of course the beaters send the boar running, and the boar comes running at Garion, and he's there with his spear and in mortal danger there. And it's just a situation where you're going, what is happening here? Who would do this? We also have this weird kind of situation where Garion has this inner monologue, this voice that is almost separate from his own mind, that keeps talking to him and talking a certain amount of sense into him whenever he has these notions to do something that might be a little bit dangerous or inappropriate. And I don't know, because I only read book 1, whether this voice is something that is going to come up in future books, and it is explained that there's some kind of psychic connection to something or someone that is guiding him and giving him sound advice, or if this just turns out to be his own thoughts giving him these ideas. But here's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Briefly, Garion considered telling his aunt about the strange, shadowless figure that had watched his struggles in the pond, but the dry voice in his mind that sometimes spoke to him told him that this was not the time for that. He seemed to know somehow that the business between him and the man on the black horse was something very private, and that the time would inevitably come when they would face each other in some kind of contest of will or deed. To speak of it now to Aunt Pole would involve her in the matter, and he did not want that. He was not sure exactly why, but he did know that the dark figure was an enemy, and though that thought was a bit frightening, it was also exciting. I have no idea how he somehow knew all of that with no context whatsoever. And like I said, hopefully that's something that's explained in further books and is not just a very convenient plot device. Sometimes Garion's intuition, it goes beyond that voice in his head too. They're searching for someone in a room, and it says, he raised the burning wisp over his head and looked around the empty room. The floor and bed were littered with rumpled clothes and personal belongings. Garion knew instantly that this was not simple untidiness, but rather was the sign of a hasty departure, and he did not know exactly how it was that he knew. As a reader, I also do not know how Garion knew that. Getting back to this mysterious black rider who is totally not a Nazgul, Garion has an up-close encounter with him in a shop when he's not on his horse, and this person glanced briefly and without seeming interest at Garion, and Garion felt a strange shock of recognition. Without knowing exactly how it was that he knew, he was instantly sure that Asherak of Rakgoska had known him for all of his life. There was a familiarity in that glance, a familiarity that had grown out of the dozen times or more that their eyes had met while Garion was growing up, and Asherak, muffled always in a black cloak and astride a black horse, had stopped and watched and then moved on. He just somehow knew without knowing how he knew. And there's one example later too of a sorceress who is our Aunt Pole here, again having a bit of a conflict with one of the queens. And out of nowhere, our sorceress says this. "Oh," Aunt Pole said, "one other thing. It would be best, I think, if you broke off your connections with the bear cult. It's hardly proper for a queen to have dealings with her husband's political enemies." And as far as I recall, that's the first time that this bear cult was ever mentioned, and I don't think they were ever mentioned again. That could just be my poor memory, but it's like out of nowhere, all of a sudden we find out that one of the queens is involved with some kind of bear cult, but we have no context whatsoever to it. So yeah, I wasn't quite sure about what was going on there. And as I worked my way through the book, at first I started asking myself the question, does the author know anything about what it's like to be a boy? I mean, clearly David Eddings was a boy at some point, so he should know, but my goodness, the way he presents Garion here makes him think like he just has no idea of what boys are like. And then as I continued through the book, I kept asking this about other issues too, and I'm like, does the author actually know anything about anything? And so the reason I first started asking this question was at the beginning of the book, Garion is roughly 7 years old-ish. We give or take a year or so. We're not given his exact age, but one night he's hanging out with his Aunt Pole, who's the one that ended up raising him because he was an orphan. And he's just out of the blue says, "Aunt Pole, yes, where's my mother?" It was a question he had been meaning to ask for quite some time. I'm like, if you're an orphan boy, and you don't have parents, are you going to wait till you're like 7 years old to ask anything about that? As soon as you learn what a mother and a father are, and the fact that you don't have a mother and a father, the first questions you're going to ask is, why don't I have a mother? What happened? A little boy is not going to be holding on to a question to ask. As soon as he learns what's happening, he's going to be asking about it. But it gets worse because, again, later on, when he's even older, he's now hanging out with the sorcerer, Mr. Wolf, and he says to this, "Mr. Wolf," Garion said after some time, "did you know my mother and father?" "Yes," Wolf said quietly. "My father's dead too, isn't he?" "I'm afraid so." So he doesn't even ask about his father at the same time he's asking about his mother, but he waits however long to then ask his first question about his father. Here's something that's at least as equally befuddling to me. So Garion, on the palm of one of his hands, has this distinct marking, this like almost a shiny silvery marking that has to do with him being the chosen one, essentially. And again, he's kind of an older boy hanging out with another girl on the farm, and she says to him, "What's that mark on your hand, Garion?" Zubret asked one rainy day, interrupting Darun's bubbling voice. Garion looked at the perfectly round white patch on the palm of his right hand. "It's always been there," Garion said, tracing the mark on his palm with his left forefinger. He had never really looked closely at it before. It covered the entire palm of his hand and had in certain light a faint silvery sheen. What? He's never looked at this perfectly round, silvery, shining mark that covers his entire palm that nobody else he's ever seen has? What? Here's another little bit that puzzled me as well. In the early autumn, just before Garion's 14th birthday, he came very close to ending his career. In response to some primal urge all children have, given a pond and a handy supply of logs, they had built a raft that summer. All children have an urge to build a raft? Maybe I was different, but I certainly never had that urge. The next couple of brief examples here made me wonder if the author had any idea of what it was like to be in a life-threatening situation, because one characteristic of being in a situation like that where your fight, flight, or freeze response is activated is that you develop this very narrow tunnel vision on the element of danger or the aspect that is of immediate potential risk to a person, which as a paramedic, it's one of the reasons why our training and repeatedly going through scenarios was important so that we would not become tunnel vision in real emergencies, but would be able to maintain a overall picture of everything that was going on around us. But in these instances, Garion has a remarkable ability to notice the craziest details when his life is being threatened. Going back to our pond and his raft, Garion has a near drowning experience where he ends up very, very close to death in a near drowning, and he gets out of it, and it says, like a broaching whale, he rose from the depths, gasped a couple of quick sputtering breaths, and heard the screams of his playmates. The dark figure on the slope, back to our not Nazgul, had not moved, and for a single instant every detail of that bright afternoon was etched on Garion's mind. He even observed that, although the rider was in the open under the full glare of the autumn sun, neither man nor horse cast any shadow. Even as his mind grappled with that impossibility, he sank once more to the murky bottom. So he's not even done drowning yet. And somehow, from his position just above the surface of the water, he notices that this rider isn't casting a shadow. Weird thing to notice when you're dying. Or going back to our situation where we have this charging boar coming through the forest straight at Garion. And here's what Garion notices as this boar is practically in his face. The boar charged, red-eyed and frothing from the mouth. With a deep-throated squeal of fury, he plunged at the waiting Garion. The powdery snow sprayed up from his churning hoofs like foam from the prow of a ship. The snow crystals seemed to hang in the air, sparkling in a single ray of sunlight that chanced just there to reach the forest floor. What? He's noticing snow crystals sparkling in the air? I'm pretty sure what he's noticing is the two giant tusks coming straight out of his face. Next, I wondered if the author knew anything about men or women. Garion began to dress. He could hear the faint murmur of the others talking softly in the adjoining chamber, in that curious, hushed tone that men always assume when they rise before the sun. We do? We always assume a curious, hushed tone? You mean they're talking quietly so that they don't wake up other people? Is that what you're talking about? I know that when I have to rise before the sun, I'm usually mumbling a stream of expletives, but I guess that's just me. Or how about this horrible statement? A fellow named Torvik is talking with Garion. Torvik says, "The lady, your aunt, seems concerned about you." "She is angry with me, I suppose," Garion said, falling into step beside the broad-shouldered man. "More than likely," Torvik said. "Women are almost always angry with us for one reason or another. It's one of the things you'll have to get used to as you get older." Oh my god. Let's just move on from that one. The next thing I wondered if the author knew anything about was snow. It snowed again the following day, but by noon Garion caught a scent other than that faintly dusty odor snow always seemed to have. Snow has a faintly dusty odor? I live in Canada. I had mounds and mounds of snow this winter, and I certainly didn't notice any smell that snow has, to be honest with you. Or here's this one. The forest was very quiet now, and the snow muffled all sounds. No bird sang, and there was only the occasional padded thump of snow sliding from overloaded branches to the earth beneath. I also did not realize that snow falling to the ground was so noisy that it made a thump. And finally, I felt the author really didn't know much about communication. First of all, we have our 3,000-year-old sorceress who doesn't seem to understand the importance and value of basic literacy. So Garion has not been taught how to read by this aunt, the sorceress who raised him. And he's talking to the sorcerer Wolf about this, and he mentions that he doesn't know how to read, and then says, "Can Aunt Pole read?" Garion asked, stunned. "Of course she can," Wolf said, leading the way into the tavern. "She says she finds little advantage in it, but she and I had that particular argument out many years ago." The old man seemed quite upset by Garion's lack of education. How does someone who's 3,000 years old not understand the absolute value of knowing how to read or teaching children how to read? And then on the subject of communication, there's also a certain group of people who have this secret finger sign language where they're able to communicate secretly to each other without even people nearby knowing that they're communicating. So not only is it a silent sign language, but it's done secretly in a way that is meant to show, not reveal to others around them that they are actually having a conversation, a wordless conversation with each other. But the wild thing about this little secret finger language is the detail of the language and the tones that are of the language that are being communicated through these simple finger movements. And so this is a finger signaling conversation now that a king is having with somebody else. So this first quote is what's being said through finger language. "I'll let you know what happens," King Rodar signaled to his queen. Her reply, "Of course." Poren gestured back. Her face was placid, but the snap of her fingers as she spoke betrayed her irritability. So I guess somehow her fingers are snapping, that's indicating a tone of irritability with how she's finger talking. And then he replies in the same sign language. "Calmly, child," Rodar's fingers told her. "We're guests here and have to obey local customs." "Whatever my lord commands," she replied with a tilt of her hands that spoke whole volumes of sarcasm. Wow, what a interesting way to communicate, as both extremely subtle and extremely detailed in the words that can be portrayed and the way in which the words are portrayed. I had to take a little break because Crohn's is gonna crone, you know, but let's get through what I think is the worst aspect of the story here, and that is, from a cultural standpoint, this is very much racism, the fantasy novel. It's pretty rough in terms of how it presents the race side of things. Like I said at the beginning of the book, you get introduced to the 7 gods. You are introduced to the fact that each of the 7 gods has its own race of people with their cultures and customs that follow the gods. And a lot of fantasy novels can kind of get away with this aspect of the stories by having the races be fantasy races. So you can have elves hating orcs because they're orcs. They're evil, nasty creatures. You can even kind of get away with elves and dwarves not liking each other very much, like with Tolkien. But things become pretty problematic when all your races are human races, and they are to a certain extent modeled after real human races. One thing that I like less and less the older I get is the kind of traditional fantasy structure of having one team that's good versus the other team that is evil, which is why I really enjoy someone like Joe Abercrombie, who presents everybody in various shades of gray, very dark shades of gray at that. So there's no real good people. Everybody has a certain amount of good in them to a certain extent, but just like real people, there's just a lot of darkness pervasive throughout. But the problem we encounter here in the Belgariad is that the primary evil people in the story are a race of people that are modeled after Asians, while the good folks are more modeled after your typical Anglo-Saxons that Western fantasy authors tend to love to write about. And there's nothing wrong with that particularly until you encounter things like how our evil character is described by the author. He was a dark, burly man wearing a chainmail shirt and a short sword belted to his waist. His cheekbones were high, and there were several savage-looking scars on his face. His eyes looked curiously angular, and his voice was harsh and thickly accented. So that's how this Murgo, that's what their race is described. And things get even more uncomfortable when we have the good characters talking about these races of people. Our 9,000-year-old sorcerer, who you would hope might know a little bit better, has this to say. There are many things in this world that seem to be one thing, but are in fact another, Wolf said somewhat grimly. I don't trust Angarax, and I particularly don't trust Murgos. It'd be just as well, I think, if you never had anything in your possession that bears the likeness of Torak. But the war between the West and the Angarax has been over for 500 years now, Garion objected. All men say so. Not all men, Wolf said. And then this other comment from a different character. Now that Garion is out of the farm and traveling in the world, he is having new experiences, like going into cities that have a variety of different peoples in them. The inn, Garion noted, was surprisingly clean, and its guests seemed for the most part to be Sundarian merchants. I thought there'd be many different kinds of people here in Muros, he said, as he and Silk carried their bundles up to the chambers on the second floor. There are, Silk said, but each group tends to remain aloof from the others. The Tolnedrans gather in one part of town, the Drasnians in another, the Neissans in yet another. The Earl of Muros prefers it that way. Tempers sometimes flare in the heat of the day's business, and it is best not to have natural enemies housed under the same roof. Garion nodded. You know, he said as they entered the chambers they had taken for their stay in Muros, I don't think I've ever seen a Neissan. You're lucky, Silk said with distaste. They're an unpleasant race. Are they like Murgos? No, Silk said. The Neissans worship Issa, the snake god, and it's considered seemly among them to adopt the mannerisms of the serpent. I don't find it at all attractive myself. Besides, the Neissans murdered the Riven King, and all Aelorns have disliked them since then. The Rivens don't have a king, Garion objected. Not anymore, Silk said. They did once, though, until Queen Salmisra decided to have him murdered. When was that? Garion asked, fascinated. 1,300 years ago, Silk said, as if it had only been yesterday. Isn't that sort of a long time to hold a grudge? Garion asked. Some things are unforgivable, Silk said shortly. So yeah, that's just a really difficult to overlook aspect of the books. Well, let's put that behind and move on to a subject that's of interest to me with my interest in historical arms and armor, and let's have a look at how they are presented in Pawn of Prophecy. Now, one sure way of knowing that you are in a fantasy book or a work of historical fiction is that you have soldiers wearing rivet-studded leather vests. After about a half hour, the gate opened again, and 24 mounted Algars, fierce in their rivet-studded leather vests and steel helmets, herded 6 saddled horses out into the snow. And you watch any movie, TV show, anything that depicts the Middle Ages or medieval fantasy, you're always going to see those studded leather vests. And obviously, medieval folks aren't going to waste their time putting random metal studs in their leather vests, unless each of those studs has on the reverse side of that leather jacket a metal plate that, when all combined together, provide some good armor protection. And here's where the author absolutely nails it. Barak led them down to the red door of the armory, where they were joined by a grizzled man with enormously broad shoulders who wore a bullhide shirt with metal plates sewn on it. So that's where those metal rivets could come from, and that's certainly historically accurate. What sort of puzzled me, again, going back to the smell of snow that the author was describing earlier, he seems to be kind of obsessed with the smell of armor, which I've spent time around medieval reenactors and various armored people, and I can tell you that the way the author describes this smell of metal emanating from the armored is not something I've experienced before. We have our character Silk talking to Barak, and Barak is known to wear this mail armor underneath his clothing. And since our group is once again adopting another disguise to try to travel unnoticed that never works, he's trying to talk Barak out of wearing his metal shirt underneath his regular clothing even. "You rattle," Silk pointed out, "and armor has a distinctive fragrance about it. From the downwind side, you smell like a rusty ironworks, Barak." No. Even if the mail armor was worn on the outside of his shirt, you're not going to smell rust emanating off of it. Here's another description of Barak at a different time. "Hulking Barak jingled as he walked, and Girion could smell the oiled steel of his mail shirt." Okay, wonder if it smells like snow. I also think the author is really over-exaggerating the amount of noise that's wearing even just a mail armor coat would make. It is very noisy to be walking around in full plate armor, but with just a mail coat, especially if it's under other clothing, I don't think there's going to be really much to be heard there.
About 58, maybe 60 decibels. It peaks at 40 decibels. So again, I'm not jingling, I'm not crinkling. There's some sound, but it's not necessarily that the rings of the mail ring out. They don't actually sound like steel, not that much. So, my normal speaking voice versus the sound of the mail shirt, very different.
And I really don't think it's going to feel like it's described here, where Girion now puts on a mail shirt, and Girion found the mail shirt heavy and more than a little uncomfortable. The steel rings dug at his skin even through his heavy clothes, and every time he tried to shift his posture to relieve the pressure of one of them, a half dozen others bit at him. It's weird to me that he can feel individual metal rings biting into his skin even through his heavy clothes. That makes no sense whatsoever. Against his skin, it's not going to be overly comfortable, but again, I don't think you're going to feel individual rings biting into your skin. In fact, I used to have a chain, a bit of jewelry that was made out of chainmail, and I don't recall it feeling like it was biting into my skin at all. But
well, after spending quite some hours just wearing this, it's pretty obvious to me, at least one of the reasons why it was very popular and why it lasted 1,000 years. It's because you don't really notice you're wearing it. It isn't particularly cold. It isn't particularly awkward or heavy. It's a little bit of, you could argue there's a little bit of strain on the shoulders. Not any strain. You feel it, like wearing a really heavy coat. But you could just get on with your day-to-day tasks. You could continue to wear your armour for a long, long period of time, and it doesn't really get in the way like some kinds of armour does.
How about actual combat styles? Here's this fascinating move made by one of the characters. We have two characters who are in an actual deadly hand-to-hand fight. It says, Silk, our character who's on the good side here, is one of them. The other scrambled away and half rose just in time to receive both of Silk's heels in his face as the rat-faced Drasnian leapt into the air, twisted, and struck with both legs. So somehow, Silk has leapt into the air, twisted around, struck out with both his heels to the guy's face. I'm like, what? What is even happening here? How do you do a double airborne kick to the face? That's pretty wild. But here's another kind of one-on-one deadly combat that I thought was very accurate. We have two men who are fighting each other in, I think this is a spiral staircase in a tower, so it's a very narrow space, and they both start out with larger weapons. One man has a sword, the other an axe, but as the fight progresses, they quickly end up just getting down to daggers and going at each other with daggers, which is very, very accurate. A lot of these hand-to-hand melee combats are going to end up with this grappling, wrestling match where your bigger weapons are no use and you're pulling daggers to get at each other through the chinks in armor and so forth. And so it's described in this manner as we get later in the fight. The impact as the two men came together tore them from their feet, and they tumbled, still grappling together down the stairs, their daggers flashing as each man struck again and again. In helpless horror, Garion watched as they rolled and crashed past him, their daggers sinking into each other with sickening sounds and blood spurting from their wounds like red fountains. And that's kind of absolutely seems like a very accurate way to describe how a fight like this would go, where you're probably going to have two losers of this combat when it comes down to two guys in a very confined space with daggers. So that's pretty well done. So in summary, I would say there's a kind of mix of good points and kind of more fantasy points, which, it's a fantasy novel, so the author can pretty much do what he wants when it comes to that sort of thing. And I really don't want to say that it's all bad here. So let's kind of end with a few good points here before I get into my rating, and then the unfortunately most disturbing part that I discovered about everything here. So the good points here, we have our character Silk again talking to Garion, and he's talking about how one of the races had elected one of their kings. And so Silk says they were elected. Nobody ever elected a king before, only the Sendars. And then Garion says, how do you elect a king? Silk smiled. Very badly, Garion. It's a poor way to select a king. The other ways are worse, but election is a very bad way to choose a king. And I'm like, that sounds about accurate. Democracy is terrible. It's working terribly. But the other options are kind of even worse. So, what can you do? And then jumping from politics to economics now, we have Garion, who has grown up on this farm, who then his first time traveling off the farm into a city, and he's kind of puzzled by the whole concept of having to pay for food. And the sorcerer Wolf says to Garion, there are places where one can buy food. Buy food? Garion had never heard of such a thing before. Anyone who appeared at Faldor's gate, the guy who owned the farm, at mealtime was invited to the table as a matter of course. The world of the villagers was obviously very different from the world of Faldor's farm. And when you stop to think about it for half a second, it is kind of crazy that food is part of our for-profit system, that people profit out of selling food. It seems to me that any developed nation nowadays has enough wealth that the very basics of food, shelter, healthcare, and education could probably be provided to its citizens, and everybody's standard of life lifted up so that the health of the nation as a whole could improve, with the idea that a rising tide floats all boats, as they say. But you communist, you and your socialist ideas. I just like to see people taken care of and basic needs met, Is that too much to ask? We get more of Garion's education here as he is wandering about the city, seeing for the first time what life off the farm is like. The salt tang of the sea was tainted here with the smell of dead fish, and the faces of the people hurrying along were grim and unfriendly. Garion's first excitement at being in a city began to fade. "Why are the people all so unhappy?" he asked Mr. Wolf. "They have a stern and demanding God," Wolf replied. "Which God is that?" Garion asked. "Money," Wolf said. "Money's a worse God than Torak himself." And yeah, such a great point to end this review on, I think, is everything, unfortunately, in life comes back to money. Money is our God. I would make an argument that even with religions, money is the true God, if I want to get really controversial. But that's why my Patreon supporters are such a hugely important part of my life, and why I feel so bad trashing this book that one of them purchased for me. As for the rating, it's not going to be good. I think I've settled on a 2 out of 10 for Pawn of Prophecy, the first book in the series. I haven't gone on to read the other books. I'm not going to continue on with the series at this point. And like I mentioned, after reading it, I looked it up on GoodReads. I saw that the rating on GoodReads is 4.16 out of 5. So if we translate that to my out of 10 scale, that's going to be an 8.32 out of 10. Vastly different than my 2 out of 10. So I thought that's interesting. And that's the point at which I started reading these other reviews that people had left, both positive and negative. And I came across something very disturbing. And it kind of comes back to my earlier questions that I had about, does the author really understand children or life in general? But here's what one of the reviewers on GoodReads said. "It's difficult to rate this book objectively in light of learning about the terrible abuse David Eddings and his uncredited co-author wife Lee perpetrated against their 2 young adopted children. Overt racial essentialism in the world the Eddings created became more and more apparent, and there were an increasing number of cringy moments between husbands and their wives, with the women inevitably being put in their place." And when I read that, I then popped over to Wikipedia, and as it turns out, Eddings and his wife Lee had adopted one boy in 1966 who was then 2 months old, and then they subsequently adopted a girl after the fact, and ultimately they pled guilty to 11 counts of physical child abuse of their adopted children. And then in 1970, the couple lost custody of both children, and they were each sentenced to a year in jail in separate trials for extensive child abuse of both children, which just made me sick. I mean, not only just a year in jail for extensive abuse of these babies they adopted, but that really put a dark pall over everything I had just read, even though my opinions on the book itself and my review was kind of more or less formed prior to that. It just really added to the fact that I was kind of done with David Eddings and didn't want to have any more to do with him or his world. So that's where I leave that. Sorry to end on such a bummer of a note. Sorry to the person who was so generous as to purchase this book. I'm very grateful they did so. I'm glad I had the opportunity to read it. I don't necessarily read a lot of older fantasy, so I was glad I had the opportunity to check it out, even though it didn't end up being something that worked for me. It did help me understand more about what I like and don't like in the genre and what I'm kind of looking more for going forward. So I do appreciate the generosity and the opportunity that I had to read the book. But what about you? Have you read anything by David Eddings? What are your thoughts on all of this? And if you haven't read Eddings, I'm always interested in hearing what you're reading. Is there anything you're particularly enjoying recently? It'd be certainly nice to talk about more positive things if you want to tell me about some things that you are having fun with. So please do get into the comments and let me know. And thanks so much for watching. Cheers. You know, you are assuming that it's not a mark on the palm of his left forefinger. No. A certain amount of enmity between races. You can have elves. The Rivens don't have a king, Garion objected. The Rivens don't have a king, Garion objected. The Rivens don't have a king, Garion objected. And I really don't think it's going to be, but that's why as for